Hello and welcome back. This is lesson 2 or lecture 2 of unit 1 on defining partition. I am your host still and your instructor, Stacy Fahrenhold. And before you begin this lesson, there are a couple things that I would like you to have accomplished. First, I'd like you to take a few minutes, if you haven't already, to go ahead and explore the syllabus. This is the first page on your Canvas web page. I'd also like you to navigate the course Canvas just a little bit to sort of familiarize yourself with it, with where everything is, and to also feel free to ask me any questions if you have a hard time finding anything. And then finally, and this is probably most important for today's lesson, I would like you to have at least started reading Dubnov and Robson's introduction, the first 27 pages of the Partitions Transnational History book. If you have not acquired a hard copy from either the bookstore or Amazon, you'll find a PDF of the entire thing in the Canvas website. So let me just share the screen real quick and we will go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up just a little bit, make it just a little bit larger so that you can see me and I can see you. So today's lesson is on defining partition. I am going to base this lesson largely on the Dubnov and Robson piece, but my ultimate goal is to give us a shared vocabulary that we will carry with us throughout the semester. You will see quite a bit of notes here for you. These are here for you. I will be uploading them in PDF after the lecture, but feel free to follow along. After this lecture, I'm also going to start every lecture with a slide like this to sort of walk us through the timeline. After this lecture, you will continue on with module number 1, watch lecture number 3. You will complete the week 1 quiz by April 6th if you want credit. It is pass fail, meaning that you either get the credit or you don't. Do it by April 6th for the full credit. And then you will also think about and then select your midterm dates by April 6th. These 3 items are the only required items on this list. In addition to that, you can visit the discussion board to ask any questions that you might have about the lessons, about the course, about the readings, any aspect of this process. You can also connect with your peers there. And then critically, I wanted to sort of put it out there that every Friday for this course, I will be doing a Zoom classroom at our normal class time. So on April 3rd, there will be a Zoom classroom session that you can join us live. You can ask your questions. We can talk about readings. We can just get to know one another. I will be responding to all of the discussion board questions there. The entire thing will be recorded and I will be putting it up on the Canvas. So if you can't make it, don't sweat it. It's not required, but it will be a space for us to connect and actually, see each other somewhat IRL. All right, so for today's lesson, remember these questions? They're the questions that we ended with last time. There are 2 questions here. Number 1, what is partition? How do scholars define partition and why does the definition matter? These are the questions that we're going to deal with today. The second question, how does partition relate to forced migration, will be the topic of lecture number 3. All right, so these are the questions that we are going to answer in the next, half hour or so. What is partition? The first thing we have to understand if we were to arrive at a definition of partition, and this is that partition isn't just something that happened in the past. It's not just a set of events where we have the redivision or reallocation of territory and the various movements of peoples to and fro across borders. This is not something that just was one and done. It happened, or it happened in multiple parts of the world throughout the 20th century, and it's over. Rather, we, as scholars, tend to think of partition as a set of historical processes that not only have their own temporal dimensions, meaning these processes have a history that we can read and understand and analyze and compare, but that it's a process that is ongoing, all right? Partition is a history that's not It's not the past, it's a history. It's something that is continuing to shape the politics, the societies, and the cultures, not just of places that experienced a partition, but the cultures and societies and politics of places that are in any way connected to partition. So partitions don't just impact the societies where they happened, they also inflect societies everywhere in the world, including our own. So that's the first thing to understand about partition, is that it's not just something that happened in the past. It's also a process that we can track and understand, and one which continues to inflect our present. Because we think of partition as something that is a historical process, furthermore, we as scholars must find a way to name and define and analyze that process through its various themes, its various legacies, its various impacts. And so scholars, when they deal with partition as a historical process, the first thing we have to do is figure out how to locate that history. How do we historicize partition? How do we talk about it as historians? When did partition happen? Where did partition happen? How did partitions happen? And how do those experiences compare to one another? Are they connected? For this course, for our purposes, in History 110W, we will be dealing with partition as a process in a couple of very specific ways. First, we're going to periodize it into two broad periods listed here under partition as a historical process. First, partition is a process that emerges very clearly in the early 20th century, and more specifically as a consequence of the post-war settlement that followed after World War I. Right after the First World War, the victorious European powers and their American allies emerged from the battlefield victorious and endeavored to negotiate a post-war settlement for the rest of the world. They got together at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, a meeting I will return to in just a moment, and they did so in the name of national self-determination and the belief that states with homogeneous ethnic, racial, and religious populations, as well as exclusivist ideas of nationalism, that those were the states that were the most stable politically, and that those were the states to be least likely to be ridden with various political conflicts. So partition was created. It was a process that was thought up in this post-World War I moment as a means of sort of resolving conflict, okay? It's something that was very much attached to the political ideas of Wilsonianism and the early partitions. These partitions that emerged in the immediate post-World War I moment in our class are the case of Ireland in 1920, 1921, and then the second case of Greece and Turkey in the years 1923 and 1924. The second wave, if you will, the second period of partition, which is in some ways distinct from the first, comes after World War II, when we see the same logic of partition being reapplied in entirely new ways in the era of decolonization. After World War II ends in 1945, the same European powers who had created the partitions in Ireland and Greece and Turkey in the 1920s instituted a second set of partitions. And these second set of partitions are India, Pakistan, and Palestine and Israel, all happening in the late 1940s. In this second set of partitions, we see the same European powers who had instituted partition in the name of national self-determination in the 1920s. Now they're reapplying partition as a policy tool in service to decolonization, and specifically the desire of Great Britain to get out of the colonial game in both South Asia and the Middle East. So partition happens in many cases across the first half of the 20th century, but we see two moments of partition, right? This post-World War I moment when it's done in the name of national self-determination, and then the decolonization moment of the late 1940s and 1950s. So let me talk a little bit about these two moments in a little bit more depth. First, I'll take the first one, the post-World War I moment, when we have the post-war settlement of the First World War at the essentially the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was the post-war settlement after World War I. The war ended in November of 1918. The conference began in January 1919, and essentially it featured the victorious Entente powers of Great Britain, France, and the United States of America, their allies, and various foreign dignitaries who gathered in the palace at Versailles in Paris in order to discuss how to settle the various territories of the vanquished, Central Powers, okay? Specifically, how do we deal with the failure of the Ottoman state and the end of the Habsburg Empire and the and how do we, settle these territories and from the ruins of these empires bring forth new nations with, identities and borders and this kind of thing. In order to accomplish this, Great Britain, France, and the United States led the proceedings, and they would hear the petitions of all peoples who could come to the palace in Versailles and describe the national aspirations of their desired states. Okay, so we have, the European powers on one hand who are deciding the fates of the world, and on the other hand we have delegations from the largely colonial world, the Ottoman world, the Middle East, the African colonies, and from South Asia, etc. The United States presided over this entire thing. Okay, and the United States president at that time was Woodrow Wilson. Anyone here who has taken a US history course knows that the biggest thing that Woodrow Wilson is famous for is that he had this idea that he called the 14 points. The 14 points by which we could effect world peace after the end of the First World War. I'm not going to go over all 14. The most important of those 14 was the right to national self-determination, which Woodrow Wilson brought to the Paris Peace Conference as its sort of modus operandi. So these guys were effecting what they hoped would be a lasting world peace. They believed that by granting all nations the right to govern themselves, right, and to nationally determine their future and their legacy, that this would be a way to stop a war from engulfing the world yet again. Okay, national self-determination, if I had to define it for you very quickly, national self-determination is the principle that every state should govern its own people, that state should represent its people in some way, and that all states should govern with the consent of the governed. Okay, it's a pretty high-minded, pretty basic ideal of statehood, which emerged in 1919. Attached to this idea of national self-determination is that every people with an identifiable and claimable national identity should have the right to a state that they can live within. Okay, this is 1919. So what determined who was a people with an identifiable national identity was really rooted in understandings of race, understandings of ethnicity, linguistic peoplehood, or religious personhood, this kind of thing. Okay, so who was a nation? A nation was a people with a clearly identifiable identity rooted in racial, ethnic, linguistic, or religious terms. These terms were also simultaneously understood to be totalizing, unitary, and assumed to be exclusive and the basis of homogeneous states. Okay, and the idea was that the world map that came out of this Paris Peace Conference of 1919 should be made up of a multiplicity of states that are all based on some kind of homogeneous or homogenizing national identity rooted in ethnicity or language or religion. All right, this works fine if you already live in a territory or a polity where everyone is the same kind of Christian, or everyone speaks the same kind of French, or everyone speaks, or I'm sorry, everyone, has a non-composite, homogeneous, static conception of their own ethnicity or race. That doesn't really work out in the real world. And the problem is that composite identities are really, really common. People can be, for instance, both Francophone and Catholic, or Francophone and Protestant. People can be both you know, Hindi speaking and Muslim. People can be both, I don't know, Christian and Palestinian. People can be both, people can have these composite identities. You can be both Jewish and French, right? And in the real world, that this is how it works. These composite identities are really, really common, and they're almost the majority, okay? The problem with Wilsonianism is that composite identities are not only not recognized by the system of national self-determination that guided the politics of the Paris Peace Conference, it's that composite identities were identified as almost a problem. Not almost a problem, they were identified as a problem. They were identified as a problem that would cause conflict on ethnic or religious or racial grounds, and that the best way to resolve or get rid of the capacity for conflict was to divide people into different nations, to divide a Catholic nation from a Protestant nation, a French-speaking nation from a German-speaking nation, Muslim nations from Christian nations, from Jewish nations, Hindi nations from you know, Pakistani nations, you know, to divide people up and then put national borders between them. According to Wilsonian ideas about partition, self-determination was rooted in creating states that were based in those homogeneous national ideas, even though those homogeneous national ideas were tended to be conflated with racial, ethnic, or religious content. Okay? This logic is what underpinned the first partitions of the 20th century. It underpinned a partition of territories along the lines of ethnic and religious identities. And it also included the forced transfer or even expulsion or deportation of populations who didn't fit the national ideal because of their various composite racial, ethnic, or religious beliefs that differed from the majority. Okay. So the Paris Peace Conference resulted in a couple of major treaties. These are the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 and the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. These are both treaties you're going to read about a bit, okay? So we don't have to belabor them right now. What we do need to understand right now, going into this quarter, is that the Treaty of Sèvres was in 1920. It was the first partition treaty of the 20th century. It created entire new maps of the Middle East and parts of Asia, and it imposed borders on these maps on the basis of what Europeans believed were the exclusivist racial come ethnic come religious ideas reordered as nations as the fundamental ordering principle for this part of the world. Okay, so it sort of split up and balkanized these parts of the world on the basis of ethnic identities, religious identities, and racial identities. The Treaty of Lausanne 4 years later further built on this logic. It deepened the logic of Sèvres. And it did so by writing up new policies for the removal, deportation, and expulsion of peoples who didn't fit the nationality ideals that Sèvres represented. So where Sèvres, in short, created a new map of the world and named its proper nationalities on the basis of national self-determination, the Treaty of Lausanne instituted a sense of partitioning of territories and the compulsory movement of peoples like refugees in order to fit the map, okay? So Sèvres created the map, Lausanne moved people like they were chess pieces on the map, okay? And this is the basis of the 1920s partitions. The two most famous partitions of the 1920s that we're going to discuss in this course are the partition of Ireland into Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This happened with a document called the Republic of Ireland Government 1920 Treaty. We'll talk about it next week. And it was a partition that was effected in 1921. It specifically named national self-determination as the basis for this partition. And then the second one is the Greek-Turkish partition. This is the partition of the Lausanne Treaty in 1923-1924. The Lausanne Treaty basically paved the way for a massive forced exchange of 2 million people, effectively deporting most of the Christians of Turkey out of Turkey and into Greece, and deporting all of the Muslims who lived in Greece back into Turkey in 1923-1924. All right, shifting gears, back to this slide, back to this second wave of partitions, the second phase of partition, the decolonization phase, okay? Both of the decolonization partitions we discuss in this class are episodes of British decolonization. So this is going to be all about the end of the British Empire and the hasty retreat of Great Britain from both its Indian holdings as well as the government, the mandate that it was holding in Palestine. This happens very, very quickly between the years 1947 and 1948-49. This happens in the context of Great Britain having been ravaged by the Second World War, which is sort of beyond the scope of this course, but Second World War happens 1939 to 1945. Great Britain is utterly destroyed in that war, and that leads Britain to want to devolve and then get out of its colonies in Asia. This means both Palestine and India in 1946-1947. Great Britain decided to get out of its colonies and tried to refer both of these issues back to the international community, which by 1946-1947, the international community is represented by the United Nations, which is the inheritor of the League of Nations founded by the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. So all of this goes right back to the international community, which only a couple of decades before tended to solve problems like the India problem, like the Palestine problem, through partition, okay? In both cases, the British confer with the international community in order to arrive at partition as the so-called solution for the problems of both India and Palestine. In both cases, there are core issues and core differences in nationalities, meaning there are composite identities among the people living in these places. There are core differences in nationality between, for instance, between Hindus and Muslims living in British India, and between Palestinian Arabs and Zionist settlers living in Palestine. In both cases, but again for different reasons, the British ultimately endorse partition in both of these places. And in both places, the British make a hasty exit, which leads to massive, massive violence in effecting these partitions. We see ethnic cleansing in both places. We see the mass displacement of refugees, almost 1 million in Palestine and almost 8 million in British India, across the new border lines that are instituted at this time. We'll read more on both of these cases. This is just to give you sort of a sense of what's happening in this second phase. So that is partition as a historical process. Let's end today by thinking about partition as a category of analysis. And this is how Dubnov and Robson talk about partition. So they have a number of different linked arguments about what a partition is and how we define it as scholars. To explore the idea of partition as scholars, we have to take a few of these ideas from the Robson piece, or Dubnov-Robson piece. And I'll let you guys read further and find a couple of more, but I've nailed a couple down just for us to get some working vocabulary. At some point, and under specific historical contexts, the political powers of the world saw partition as the solution to various types of communal strife. Communal strife meaning conflicts that have a racial, ethnic, or religious dimension. And Partition emerged in this context as what was supposed to be a political solution in order to lessen, not deepen, conflict between people who were different from one another in religious, ethnic, or ethnic, or racial terms. Okay. Next, partition emerges in the context of colonialism in the 1920s or decolonization in the 1940s, 1950s. Dubnov and Robson talk more about this, so I won't belabor this point. Next, ethnic separatism becomes a core aspect of national self-determination as an ideal. This is the moment when nationality becomes suffused and even conflated with other categories of identity. And this becomes a problem because the international forum, as well as the European powers, write policies on the assumption that these categories are totalizing and unitary and must be dealt with through partition rather than multiculturalism or tolerance. Next, partitions lead to the creation, for the first time in world history, they lead to the creation of something we might call a national majority and a national minority. So we have the creation of national majorities and minorities in specific states and specific polities. This is common sense, but it's important because the claims of majority rule have to be balanced against the rights of minorities to legal protection for the first time. The state has to find new ways to balance them now that they're being categorized in this way, not as, Jews or Arabs or Muslims or Christians, but as majorities and minorities. Next, partition tends to abet both massive violence as well as forced displacements. And as historians, these are experiences that we have to analyze: the violence of partition, the forced displacement and forced migration of partition. It's part of the process, and it's one of the grandest legacies of this history. And finally, the lasting legacy of partition is a tendency towards the geopolitics of deferral. That's what Dubnov and Robson call it, the geopolitics of deferral, which I like. And so what they mean by this is that states that are impacted by partition are hindered in their ability to solve political problems in a number of ways that are predictable and comparable and analyzable, okay? The problems that partition creates in these societies are substantial. How, for instance, do you balance the political claims of majorities versus minorities? That's one problem. How do you deal with the violence that ends up being usually directed at ethnic, racial, or religious minorities in these states? How do you deal with resettlement of refugees? How do you deal with displacement of people from their homes? How do you deal with the way that partition warps the national self-perception? How do we deal with the national identities or nationalist visions or nationalist politics that arise out of partition experiences? And 5, how to deal with migration, immigration, or people who have composite identities. These are all problems that arise out of a partition experience, and critically, none of those problems arising from partition can readily be addressed without first rethinking the logic of the partition itself. And here's the problem. To rethink the logic of partition is basically unthinkable in post-partition states, and we observed this across all of the states that we're going to discuss in this quarter, that it's unthinkable and impossible to rethink the logic of partition because it undoes the fundamental political systems that created the states in the first place, right? And so the problems that come out of partition can't be solved, and these societies get a little bit stuck in their political debates and in the debates around the problems that partition caused, okay? And so this geopolitics of this geopolitical deferral that Dubnov and Robson are talking about are where states attempt to defer finding long-term solutions to the problem of partition and instead focus their efforts on short-term survival. Okay, so for instance, states like this might focus on how to provide for refugees living in refugee camps rather than dealing with the right of refugees to return to their homes or not, right? And so that's what they mean by geopolitical deferral, and it's a really, really critical piece of what makes partition partition. So here is the entire list for today. I'm going to give you one moment just to pause the video and take down this entire list if you have not already. You get it? Good. Okay. I'll end with just a couple moments to give you some ideas about why the definition matters. This is the second part of our first question, right? Now that we know what partition is, now that we've defined it, why does the definition of partition matter? The first reason is that ideas travel. Ideas about what makes a nationality travel the world in the 1920s through the 1950s. Ideas that partitioning new territories or hardening borders will solve political conflict. These are ideas that travel. It doesn't really matter if they're good ideas or bad ideas. These ideas travel and they impact the way that various states govern their people, the way that we govern our borders, and this kind of thing. And so that's one of the reasons why our definitions of partition matter. Next, our definition matters because partition continues to inflect the politics of nationality and citizenship into our current moment, even today. And partition inflects the politics of nationality and citizenship, not only in places that experience partition, but in all places around the world, okay? Because this is a story about international law as much as it's a story about partition in 5 different contexts, or 5 different parts of the world. Next, the definition matters because partitions tend to create border anxiety. Okay, so they don't just create borders, they create anxieties around borders. And with those border anxieties, we see things like this politics of deferral, which I've just discussed. We see things like hardened borders. We see things like immigration policies that are restrictive. We see things like border walls, okay, emerging as a result of these anxieties about the border and what it represents. And then finally, we see ideas about migrants and refugees being dangerous. And we see the production of migration and refugees as a crisis. We see a crisis politics emerge around migrants, migration, immigration, and refugees. And so this is the final reason why our definition of partition matters. I want to highlight this last one, this migrant and refugee crises part of this legacy, because that's where we're heading next. If you'll remember, these are the 2 questions we're focusing on this week. In lecture 3, which is the next lecture that you will watch, we will focus on the relationship between partition and forced migration more closely, and we will seek an answer to how does partition relate to forced migration? Why do scholars discuss them jointly? Sound good? Make sure you take this question down. I'm going to return lastly to this slide, remind you all, after you finish with this lecture, you can move to the next lecture. I would not perhaps recommend watching them all in a row. That's a lot to take in all at once, but at some point during week 1, watch lecture 3. After you've finished all 3 lectures, 1, 2, and 3, you're ready to complete week 1, the week 1 quiz. That quiz is due, if you want to get it for points, it's due by April 6th. You should also pick your midterm dates by April 6th, okay? If you do not pick your midterm dates by April 6th, I will pick them for you. And then, you know, consider navigating the course canvas, visit the discussion board, ask any questions you like of me about what you've just heard, about the readings, any aspect of the course, and I will address them in the April 3rd Zoom classroom. You can join us April 3rd during our normal class time. In order to access that Zoom classroom, you'll see, if you go down the left side of the canvas, you will see Zoom is one of the links on the left side of that Canvas page. You click that link and then you will find the April 3rd session. Join us live. If you can't join us live, I will record it and upload it into the class discussion board. Okay? That's all, guys. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you next time and look forward to working with you this quarter. Thanks.